Hello folks and welcome to the second part of my mastering tutorial, and now let's kick it up with the EQing. Again, keep in mind we don't want to fix issues, we want to enhance, and for that we have to keep a broader perspective. So don't get lost in details, okay? Let's just give the mix a first listen, okay? And then just check in what needs to be done. All right. So first thing I want to do is I want to check my low end, okay? We want to have it clean and clear. So we could perhaps start off with a high pass filter. Let's just put it to, let's say 30 hertz. That was 20, I want to add 30. And with a slope of 24 dB per octave. Okay, and that way we make sure the low end doesn't wobble around uncontrollably and probably mess things up later on as we go into the compressors. And anyways, for hard rock and metal, we don't need those low frequencies, okay? And barely any speakers really reproduce such low frequencies anyways. Even your average subwoofer only goes down to about 30 hertz. So, yeah. And depending on the style of the music, if it is a bit faster paced, then perhaps we can clean it up a bit more and go to about 40 hertz with that cut. But again, it also depends on how the kick and the bass are already mixed. And if they are rather well mixed, then this is fine. Now, I actually used this 30 hertz cut twice in my master chain. Once at the very first position, again, to make sure it's cleaned up and doesn't mess up my compressors, and a second time just before the limiter. Because in my master chain I will still use saturation, and with its coloring and the distortion, it recreates those low frequencies again. And I then want to cut them out again to keep it all clear before it hits the limiter. So yeah, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Now to the actual EQing. Well, there's not that much to say about it, really. I mean, it all just depends on your mix, and there's no special trick to it. Just remember, we want to be subtle in mastering, okay? Because when we boost too much, then you may actually start to change some volume balances of some instruments. For example, if you boost the high end too much because the mix sounds too dull, well, then the cymbals may start to be too loud in comparison to the rest. And to avoid such issues, again, the mix should be as good as possible. Now, here's just one trick that I like to use when I EQ. Perhaps you have noticed, when you make things louder or you really crank up the volume, then it starts to sound a bit harsher. Well, perhaps it's due to the speakers also, but mostly it's because of the way the human ear perceives the audible frequency range at different volume levels. Just Google the Fletcher-Munson curve if you want to have some more info on that. But I like to exploit it for mastering. For example, what I like to do, I just play the song, I crank the volume, I check if it sounds too harsh, and then I may reduce in the 2 to 4K area a little bit to make sure it's nice and silky. And then I turn down the volume again and check if it's too silky or lacking something in the upper mid-range. And so I find my balance. Now, let me just demonstrate how I would EQ this mix now. Okay. So let's listen in again. Okay, perhaps I want to start off with making the mix a bit brighter. So I'll use a high shelf, and for this I'll use the VEQ. Many people would tell you, don't use a non-linear EQ on mastering, but I never had a problem with this EQ, and it has a lot of character. I really like it. So let's just check this out. I'll go to 15K. Yeah, that's already enough. Now, although I went to 15K, it doesn't just precisely boost 15K. Uh, this shelf from the VEQ is rather broad, okay? So just use whatever EQ you have at your disposal and however it works best for your mix. But this sounds pretty good already. And now I want to be a bit more specific, so let me get my... now I want to check my harshness, so I will crank up the volume and see what happens. So you be careful when I crank up the volume. That sounds already better. No, you can already see here the changes. Minus 0.8 dB. It's not a lot, but it's enough to clean it up. And a change of minus 1 dB was already too much, okay? So minus 0.8 seems to be pretty good. Okay, now what I still notice is I want to clean up the low end a little bit. And perhaps I'll go to the 80 hertz area. Because for my mix, the 80 hertz section seems to be a kind of cross section between the kick and the bass. And I kind of want to give it a little notch down just to have it a bit cleaner and more defined. Starting to like that. And I still notice, although I already gave the mix a broad high shelf, I want to give it a bit more of a narrow high shelf at around 10K, just to add a bit more air, a bit more brilliance in there. Now what I also still notice, well, this 200 hertz area, I want to give it a bit more there, just to kind of give the mix a tad more fatness and give the snare this little bit more bam. And last thing I notice, I perhaps want to give the low end a bit more bald. So I'll just go again to my VEQ and give it a low shelf boost. And yeah, this sounds already done to me for EQing. Of course, when the vocals come in, I may still need to EQ some stuff, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. And as you already saw here, I made changes of maximum 1 dB. And you see, we are subtle here, okay? We have to be delicate. And now let me give you before and after, without and with the EQing. So without. And there you have it. And usually, as I do this, I also compare my mix to some reference mixes of just some bands I like. Because using reference mixes really helps you to clearly identify what you still need to do on your mix or your master in this case. So, but again, for that, you need to have a critical ear and some ear training. So, yeah. Now, as to where to put the EQ, well, you'll find a lot of debate going on the net. It's kind of interesting. So some people will say to put the EQ before the compressor, so the compressor doesn't work too hard against some bad frequencies that you don't want to have. And others say EQ behind the compressor, so the compressor doesn't kind of flatten out or soften your EQ changes. And then others say cut before the compressor and boost behind the compressor. Now, those are all good arguments, but they rather attend to mixing, and we are talking about mastering here. As you saw, the EQ is rather subtle, yet effective, and when we go into the dynamic processing, there we will be subtle again, and then it doesn't make any big difference whether you EQ before or behind the compressors, okay? And there's really just one question that matters here. Is the mix good or is the mix bad? If the mix is good, it really doesn't matter. When we are done with dynamic processing, I can give you a comparison. And if you do hear a difference, you'll get a cookie. But generally speaking, really, there is no right or wrong. Just do what feels right, what gives you the better results, and what makes you comfortable and what makes every cell in your body happy. Now, on the other hand, if the mix is bad, by which I mean you probably do need to fix one or the other issue, in that case, I do recommend EQing before the compressor. Because you want to take care of issues before going into any dynamic processing. For example, if you have too much low end in the mix, you may want to reduce it with a low shelf or something, just to make sure it doesn't make any troubles with the compressors later on. Because especially low end eats up your headroom, okay? So, tricky. Okay, so that's all I can say for EQing in the mastering stage at this point. And yeah, stay tuned for some more.